everyone, and welcome to the 2021 virtual Gaithersburg Book Festival. I'm Amy McGuire, and I'm your host for tonight's presentation. Before we get started, I'd like to ask you to please consider supporting these authors by purchasing their books from our wonderful bookseller partner, Politics and Prose. You'll find purchase links in the presentation description. Given all that we've been through over the past year, it's so important to support local and independent stores. I also want to extend a big thank you to our 2021 featured sponsor, the David and Michael Blair Family Foundation, for their generous support. Okay, let's begin. Tonight's presentation features two outstanding journalists and authors who will discuss their new biographies featuring two of America's most politically influential women. The Triumph of Nancy Reagan by Washington Post columnist Karen Tumulty is the definitive biography of the fiercely vigilant and politically astute First Lady who shaped one of the most consequential presidencies of the 20th century. This book explores the multifaceted character of Nancy Reagan and reveals new details surrounding the turbulent presidency. Karen spent 4 years interviewing the people who knew the president and First Lady best and draws on overlooked archives, letters, memoirs, and White House records, compiling the most extensive biography of Nancy Reagan yet. Karen is a columnist and former political correspondent for the Washington Post, where she received the Toner Prize for excellence in political reporting. She previously spent 15 years at Time magazine as congressional correspondent and White House correspondent, and 14 years with the Los Angeles Times, where she covered a wide variety of beats. Karen earned a Bachelor of Journalism from the University of Texas at Austin and an MBA from Harvard Business School. Journalist and best-selling author Susan Page brings us her latest biography, Madam Speaker, Nancy Pelosi and the Lessons of Power. Nancy Pelosi has lived on the cutting edge of the revolution in both women's roles and in the nation's movement to a fiercer and more polarized politics. She has established herself as a crucial friend or formidable foe to US presidents, a master legislator, and an unrelenting political warrior. Featuring more than 150 exclusive interviews with those who know her best and a series of in-depth newsmaking interviews with Pelosi herself, Madam Speaker is unprecedented in the scope of its exploration of Nancy Pelosi's remarkable life and of her indelible impact on American politics. Susan Page is the Washington Bureau Chief of USA Today and the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Matriarch, Barbara Bush and the Making of an American Dynasty. She has covered 6 White House administrations, 11 presidential elections, and has interviewed 10 presidents. Susan has served as president of the White House Correspondents Association and won every journalism award given specifically for coverage of the presidency. Welcome, Karen and Susan.
Thank you so much, Amy.
Hey, it's great to be with you back at the Gaithersburg Book Festival. Such a great festival. I can't wait until we can all do it in person again next year.
And it is also so great to be here with my good friend, Susan Page, who I love to tease her that she has managed to write 2 books in less than the time it took me to write 1 book. But Susan, as I was reading your book and writing my book, it struck me that yes, these are biographies of 2 very controversial women. If you were to take their fan clubs, the membership would not overlap at all. But both of these books really are studies in power, I think, of 2 women who essentially had to sort of invent it as they went along. 2 women separated by a generation. And one of the things, though, that really struck me, and of course, with Nancy Pelosi, her big challenge was getting people to recognize her power. For Nancy Reagan, it was in hiding the power that she actually wielded. But both of them, I think, what hasn't been recognized enough is really that how pragmatic they both are, despite the sort of reputations they have as ideologues. I mean, how do you see the contrast?
They're both such, one reason they're both each so interesting is that they're both transitional figures, I think. When you think about it, while Nancy Reagan was born a little before Nancy Pelosi, who was born in 1940, both of them were before kind of the women's revolution really expanded expectations and opportunities for women. So when Nancy Pelosi graduated from college, she was in Nancy D'Alessandro. She followed a very traditional path. She got married. She went with her husband to his hometown of San Francisco. She had 5 children in 6 years and a week. She gave a commencement address at her alma mater that called that the Catholic way. And it was only when she was 47 years old that she first sought elective office, even though she had been born into this very political family. In a way, Nancy Pelosi had a much more traditional beginning in those first couple decades of adulthood than Nancy Reagan did. Nancy Reagan was a career woman, not the kind of traditional wife and mother, a role that Nancy Pelosi embraced. Do you think of Nancy Reagan as a kind of a revolutionary in her own way or not?
Well, it's interesting. She would always say, oh, I only pursued a career, and she did graduate from Smith College, at a time when women did not really go to Smith College or pretty much any college with this idea of pursuing a career. I mean, their goal in life, she gets there in 1939. She graduates in the middle of World War II in 1943. Betty Friedan, of all people, is a year ahead of Nancy Davis at Smith. And she said, and this group of women actually inspires Betty Friedan to write The Feminine Mistake, because she said, we had no role models. There were no expectations of women to have careers. And essentially all they really wanted was to, live out this sort of mid-century ideal where you find the right mate and you raise his children and you keep supper warm for him to get home at night. And Nancy Reagan, though, graduates with essentially, no prospects for somebody to marry. And she would always say, I became an actress because I didn't have anything else to do. And of course, certainly when she meets Ronald Reagan, not at a moment in his life where you would have said, oh, there were great things ahead for this guy. His film career is coming to an end. His first wife has walked out on him. But for her, that really was sort of latching onto this mid-century ideal. However, once his ambitions start to take him in a different direction, she is not only fully on board, but she is building the scaffolding for his rise, I think, in ways that Ronald Reagan, who was really a sort of solitary figure, would have been incapable of doing on his own.
Yeah. And she had to cloak her power, right? It put people off the idea that she was wielding power. I remember when I covered the Reagan White House, this was a source of endless speculation and a million stories about the role of Nancy Reagan behind the scenes. And clearly she had a big role on a lot of big decisions. And that's in contrast with Nancy Pelosi, who has wielded power, amassed and wielded power, not through a spouse, but on her own. Her husband was involved in her first congressional campaign, a special election, 1987. But then since then, she's been pretty much an independent figure in terms of amassing power, winning elections, holding power, and especially wielding power. And her wielding of power is so much more transparent in a way than Nancy Reagan. One of our friends, John Bresnahan, now with Punchbowl News, was with Politico when he did a profile of Nancy Pelosi that I like very much. It was about 11 years ago. And he described her as an iron fist in a Gucci glove, an iron fist. And that is the perfect description of how Nancy Pelosi has managed to hold and wield power over several decades. She has a Gucci glove. She can be very persuasive. She can figure out what people really want, how to move them persuade them toward the point of view that she wants them to take, to cast the kind of vote she wants them to cast. But if she needs to, she pulls out that iron fist and she's willing to use it. That's a freedom that Nancy Reagan never had, even at her most powerful moments. How did she wield her power without having the freedom to be doing it in public?
Well, she would always say, "Oh, I don't get involved in policy issues. I only get involved in people issues." But of course, anybody who's been in Washington for more than 30 seconds know that, the power to decide who is in the room when there is advice to be given or a decision to be made really can preordain the outcome. And so while she very rarely set foot in the West Wing, everybody who worked there knew when she was unhappy about something. And people who were not in her favor didn't tend to last for very long. But people who understood that what a crucial ally she could be, and I would rank among the top of those, obviously Michael Deaver, her close ally throughout, but people like James Baker, the White House Chief of Staff, George Shultz, the Secretary of State, they understood that she was an incredibly important ally to have. She's one of the reasons Ronald Reagan went through a half dozen national security advisors, and one of them, William Clark, who she was involved in getting rid of, would later say people always talked about how the White House was run by a troika of Baker, Deaver, and Ed Meese, the most ideological of them. He said the real troika was Baker, Deaver, and Nancy. But again, I think the marriage here is really what this is all about. She's watching her husband's back, whereas Paul Pelosi is just, I think, a pretty invisible figure. I think most Americans could not tell you what he looked like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Paul Pelosi, I was glad to have the chance to interview him for the book because he doesn't do very many interviews. The last interview I could find that he did was in 2007 with 60 Minutes. And I asked him why he was hard to get. And he said that he said that when Nancy Pelosi was first running for office, first seeking that congressional seat, that people kept coming to him either to tell him things or to ask questions or to give advice. And she would tell them, "You should talk to Nancy, don't talk to me." He was from a prominent political family in San Francisco. His brother Ron was a member of the city council. The family was well known around town. He thought it wasn't helpful for people to think that he was the power behind the Nancy Pelosi political campaign. And that over time, people, of course, got used to the idea that if you wanted to talk to Nancy Pelosi, don't talk to Paul Pelosi, talk to Nancy. He said he did do something that has been very useful to him, and that is earn a lot of money. He was he was involved in an early way in business in what is now everyone calls Silicon Valley. He's been a very successful investor. They now own a vineyard. And he said that financial stability, of course, was enabling for her. It meant that she didn't need to worry about money, for one thing. So then that way he was helpful. He's very supportive of her career. And I sort of think that before there was Douglas Emhoff, there was Paul Pelosi kind of figuring out this unfamiliar role for a man to be the spouse of someone who is so very powerful in Washington.
Well, the other thing that I think that the two Nancys each confronted, and again, in very different ways, was this sort of, when they would weigh in, they both had incredible political instincts. With Nancy Pelosi, it was literally in her DNA. But there was this sort of this attitude among the men who surrounded them, which was like, just who do you think you are? when Nancy Pelosi's getting very frustrated as to why the Democrats can't get control of the House back. Nobody wants to hear her advice. And Nancy Reagan would find the same thing. At one point, when Don Reagan, who was White House Chief of Staff in the second term, with whom she famously clashed and ultimately got fired, when she calls him up to talk to him about something, he says, if you have anything to say, why don't you talk to one of my subordinates? At which point she goes, Don, I don't really think I need to talk to any of your subordinates. I think you should be taking my calls.
I remember that I covered that incident, that whole furor I was working for Newsday then covering the White House. And so Nancy succeeds in getting Reagan fired, and Reagan gets his revenge. He writes a memoir with something that was just, none of us understood at the time and was just explosive. Tell us about that.
Sure. It is revealed that she has been relying upon an astrologer, of all things, a woman in San Francisco, to determine the president's schedule. I mean, things like Air Force One would take off at 2 a.m. from Andrews Air Force Base, and they would make up these cover stories to tell the press, like, oh, yeah, we're doing that because the doctor said it's better for jet lag. But this goes back to, in part, Hollywood's kind of a superstitious place. I mean, and both Reagans had they dallied in astrology, as did many people in Hollywood going back to the 40s and the 50s. But where this becomes a compulsion on her part, and I tried to take the reader minute by minute by minute at one point through the day that Reagan gets shot 2 months into his presidency. She, for reasons that I trace back to her very insecure, traumatized childhood, she's got an anxious personality anyway. But this implants in her this idea that every time her husband sets foot out of the White House, there's somebody waiting there to finish off the job that John Hinckley didn't. And where Ronald Reagan, when he was very close to death, much closer than people realized, he actually has this religious faith where he believes God preserved me for a reason. God has a plan for me. Nancy Reagan, the adoptive father who she adored, was, for all intents and purposes, an atheist. She does not have this kind of reassurance that comes from religious faith. So she is just like grabbing onto anything, essentially, that could get her through the day. But, again, religion comes back here too, because, Nancy Pelosi would say her brother was raised to be mayor. Her brother was raised to go into politics. She was just raised to be holy. And we do see this Catholicism that on the one hand seems to drive so much of her when she tells Donald Trump that she's praying for him. I mean, that like makes his head explode. But on the one hand, she so openly breaks with the church on what are some doctrinal issues like abortion, and yet her Catholicism seems to drive her in so many other ways.
You could not have had two women with different childhoods than these two Nancys, because Nancy D'Alessandro was born into this large, close Italian-American family, lived in Little Italy. Her parents, Tommy the younger and Big Nancy D'Alessandro, moved into a house when they got married. They didn't move out. They stayed there until the days they died. Nancy D'Alessandro was their seventh child and only daughter. They had had 6 boys. One of them had died in childhood, but they had 5 boys when she was born. You can imagine how treasured she was. One girl after all these boys, the final child they had. And there was one of Nancy D'Alessandro's elementary and high school classmates told me that she thought that Nancy's mother had promised God that if he would only give her a girl after all these boys, she would make her a nun. And we do know that Nancy D'Alessandro at one point suggested to her daughter that she consider being a nun, and that Nancy responded that she didn't really think being a nun sounded that interesting, but she might be interested in being a priest. Because I think that is definitely recognizing where the power in the parish was. She went from kindergarten to 12th grade at the Institute of Notre Dame, an all-Catholic girls' school in Baltimore, also the school where Barbara Mikulski attended, by the way, another famous, groundbreaking female politician. She went to college at what was then Trinity College, now Trinity University in Washington, also a Catholic girls' school. And I think that, of course, she, as you say, she's broken with the church on issues like abortion rights, but the sense of social justice is that underlies a lot of her political positions, I think, is very much a reflection of her Catholic upbringing.
And, the other thing is, you talk about childhoods. I mean, Nancy D'Alessandro never for 1 second is not being given reassurance that she is loved and she is cherished. I mean, to the point where she finds it stifling at times. Whereas, Nancy Reagan, born Anne Frances Robbins, is born into a marriage that's already over. Her biological father disappears. Her mother, an actress, abandons her with relatives. In fact, I drive by it quite often. You can still see that the house in Bethesda, where she was left with relatives and to spend 6 very unhappy years yearning for her absent marriage, the house is still there and very close to downtown Bethesda. Her mother ultimately comes back, retrieves her, says, "I've found a husband and I'm moving to Chicago." The husband is a pioneering neurosurgeon, although you see these patterns for the Reagan marriage there too, because he's also this kind of aloof figure. It's really the mother, her mother, Edith, who engineers their rise through Chicago society. But still, Nancy, their daughter, never really gets the security that she is craving. I mean, she worships her stepfather, but ultimately at the age of 14 has to engineer her adoption herself because she is still an outsider, even in this family. So you do see, I mean, she just doesn't have that kind of reassurance. Her son, Ron, told me it really did leave her with the shadow on her spirit that never lifted, this anxiety, this fear of abandonment that never, ever lifts, which again is one main reason why the assassination attempt is just such a trauma for her. And ultimately, of course, Ronald Reagan does leave her. He is diagnosed with Alzheimer's, which puts him on a journey where she cannot follow. And, she becomes both the, caretaker and guardian of his physical well-being and his dignity. But ultimately, it falls upon her to shape his legacy. And again, she is exerting incredible power throughout, but it is always in the interest of fostering his well-being and his career. She had no ideology beyond what she believed was best for Ronald Reagan.
Yeah. They had these very different childhoods and very different relationships with their father or stepfather, for sure. But they both had remarkable mothers, remarkable women who were not in the mold of their era, who were smart and ambitious and got things done. You were talking about Nancy Reagan's mother, who had this remarkable career in entertainment and then became this figure in Chicago. Nancy Pelosi's mother, who was known by everyone as Big Nancy D'Alessandro, was smart and restless and ambitious. She kept trying to go to law school. That never worked out. Her husband was not, Tommy the elder was not enthusiastic about her going to law school. She took risks. She played the ponies at Pimlico. Sometimes she was in debt to the bookies in Little Italy, and her husband had to come clean things up, pay off the bookies, the debts that his wife had amassed. She was this inventor. She invented this machine called Beauty by Vapor, which was a kind of aluminum can with a heating coil at the bottom and a hole at the top. And she marketed this. She filed a patent for it. She patented this machine. She marketed it as a way to get beautiful, wrinkle-free skin. And that you were supposed to pour her precious oils, which she also sold, into this machine and plug it in, and the heating coil would make steam come up. I think the precious oils were basically olive oil, but be that as it may, one of my kids last year went on eBay and found a Nancy D'Alessandro Beauty by Vapor machine on eBay, bought it for $34 and gave it to me for my birthday. And you put water in it and plug it in and it still works.
So how does it feel on your skin, or do you end up just feel like salad dressing?
My skin is now, of course, wrinkle free and totally youthful looking because I've used this. Actually, I can't attest that it works with the promise of beautiful, youthful skin. I can only say that it continues to create steam, which was what it was designed to do.
So the other thing, so Nancy Pelosi now is, 80 years old, and still, at the just kind of zenith of her power. And the sort of paradox of all of this is a woman who didn't even start her political career until she's in her 40s. And yet, I remember finding the first mention of her in the New York Times was during the 1984 Democratic Convention, which she did so much to bring to San Francisco. I mean, at what point, and she was a fundraiser and she was an organizer. What do you think finally drove her to decide? And she told me when she comes to Congress to fill the term of somebody, Sala Burton, who's died in office, she thought, I'll be here a few terms and then I'll go back to my life. What do you think drove her to really step to the forefront, to knock a whole bunch of guys who were in line ahead of her out of the way?
It's such a classic story at the beginning, especially for women of her generation in politics. It took another woman telling her she should do it before she actually ran for office. George Mitchell told me he had encouraged her to run for governor of California. Jerry Brown had encouraged her to run for office. She had always poo-pooed it, not actually seriously considered it. But Sala Burton, who was a friend and the widow of the legendary Phil Burton, when she was dying of cancer, called Nancy Pelosi in, whom she knew through Democratic politics in California, and encouraged her to run in the special election that would follow Sala Burton's death, and told her that she would endorse or put out an endorsement for her, which was a big asset then. That was one of those wild San Francisco elections with 14 candidates, some of them kind of loony in the primary. But the thing that made her, and so she won that election and has never lost one since. But I think the thing that made her pursue such an ambitious agenda in Washington, become such a leader, and then run a basically insurgent campaign to get into the leadership over Steny Hoyer, who thought he was in line for that job. I think she just discovered she was really good at it. All her training, her DNA, her political DNA, all the training she'd had, even her experiences as the mother of five, contributed to her skills as Speaker of the House. Let me ask you a question about Nancy Reagan that I don't know the answer to, which is, was Nancy Reagan helpful to women who wanted to run for office or be powerful, or did she feel any of that? I'm wondering if she would have described herself as a feminist, because Nancy Pelosi would describe herself as a feminist. Would Nancy Reagan have described herself as a feminist, and would she have seen a role for herself in encouraging other women to do big things?
She would absolutely not have described herself as a feminist. And, you see her in the 76 campaign when Reagan is running against Gerald Ford and almost wins the Republican nomination. She is seen as the foil to free-spirited Betty Ford. In the 1980 campaign, she's the, glamorous, acquisitive foil to, down-to-earth Rosalind Carter, although she would then say, I would never have sat in on cabinet meetings or National Security Council. No, she wouldn't have, because she had plenty of ways of making herself, her will felt without doing that. She was a very good friend to a lot of women, including, interestingly enough, and I interviewed her for the book, Carol McCain, John McCain's first wife. The Reagans had gotten to know the McCains shortly after he was released as a POW from Vietnam. In the 76 campaign, the McCains are both working for Reagan, but it is really Carol who is doing the work on the ground, organizing in Florida, where they are living at the time. So when John McCain walks out of this marriage, Nancy swoops in and really takes Carol McCain under her wing. She becomes Nancy's traveling companion on the 1980 campaign. She ultimately runs the visitor's office in the White House. So she could be very protective and very supportive of women on this sort of personal level. But in a professional setting, you would often see, it was sort of the opposite. And you wrote in your biography of Barbara Bush, and I write quite a bit in my book, for instance, how these two women just could not stand each other. It was like, I don't even know how aware people in Washington were at the time of this, but, if she was in a setting where she felt that somebody's husband was a threat to her own husband's prospects or whatever, she could be really quite brutal on.
That's such a great example. The relationship between Nancy Reagan and Barbara Bush is endlessly interesting and delicious. And of course, I know about it from Barbara Bush's perspective, which was that Nancy Reagan was an impossible person and always mean to her, and just inexplicable. I think she could not understand Nancy Reagan's priorities, and finally, Barbara Bush, had a conversation with Nancy Reagan on the phone soon after they had moved out of the White House, in which she said, "I never want to talk to you again," and hung up on her. And they never had a real conversation again. So tell us, what was Nancy Reagan's perspective on Barbara Bush? Because, of course, there's always two sides to a story.
Well, of course. And Barbara Bush could dish it out as well as take it. And there is I think we both allude to an episode when George Herbert Walker Bush is beginning to run for president himself. And Barbara Bush goes back to the back of Air Force Two, where the press sits, and she starts doing these absolutely brutal imitations of Nancy Reagan, which everybody thinks is hilarious. But at one point, Lou Cannon, who's on the plane, says to her, "Mrs. Bush, Mrs. Reagan has eyes and ears everywhere. She's going to hear about this." To which Barbara Bush says, "I know." I think that one thing is the two of them never really let go of the acrimony from the very brutal 1980 primary campaign. Barbara Bush never hid whose husband she thought ought to be in the Oval Office versus attending the funerals of foreign leaders. But I think there was a lot about Barbara Bush that really triggered Nancy Reagan's insecurities. Nancy Reagan is just brutalized in the press for her fancy clothes and her fancy habits. Barbara Bush also has a closet full of designer clothes, but she is just lionized in the press as America's grandmother, and just glowing press start to finish. And I do think there was also a lot about the Bush family that triggered a lot of Nancy Reagan's insecurities. I mean, and the other thing, Barbara Bush traces her lineage to the Mayflower. Nancy Reagan's seen as coming out of Hollywood, But I think that, the Bush family, you have this big, big, loving, close-knit family. The kids are around, the grandkids are around. The Reagan family had just such deep, deep dysfunction that they were really, the Bushes were always kind of a reminder of kind of the idealized family that, certainly the Reagans, they stood for family values, but if you looked inside their own family, it was kind of hard to live up to the ideals.
Both of these women, Nancy Reagan and Nancy Pelosi, are controversial. They have people who love them and people who hate them. I'll be curious to what kind of audience is listening to our talk here, because I would think you, with the Nancy Reagan book and with the Nancy Pelosi, we're probably drawing different groups. As you said, the Venn diagram may not have any shaded area at all. Tell us what kind of reaction you've gotten to your book. Have you gotten pushback from those who do not love Nancy Reagan?
Oh my goodness, yes. I mean, like social media. How dare you even write a book about Nancy Reagan? But the critical reaction to this book has been astonishing. I mean, the reviews have been just remarkably over the top positive. I think because, I did spend 4.5 years getting to the complexity of this woman. I mean, peeling back just layer after layer after layer after layer. I think that her contribution to her husband's success has never been fully recognized before. And I think that, for all of her flaws and for all of the problems that many of which she brought on herself, when it came to choosing a partner, Ronald Reagan did pretty well.
I think both of us were trying to do not odes to these women, but works of journalism about their lives. And I think that both of them were not always, their contributions not always recognized, and sometimes vilified for reasons that had to do with their gender, not with their value. I know my point was not to say Nancy Pelosi was terrific or terrible, but that she was important, that she had an impact that ought to be recognized. It seems to me you were doing the same thing with your book. I hope people approach, I hope readers, neither of these are books that take a political point of view. They're books that say, here's someone who was significant and not yet understood in a full way. Here's a serious look at them and their lives.
And what I hope people will also understand is that understanding women who are more complicated than they seem, women who really trigger very, very strong reactions from people in their lifetimes, that, it can become a way of understanding not only these people, but just an entire era of our country's history, of really kind of, putting a mirror on the times that they lived through. I find it interesting that they both were transplanted to California. I mean, a state that, stands for reinvention. They lived through really dramatic eras of intense political change. that in some ways begins in California and spreads to the rest of the country. So I really do hope, as you said, that people will sort of set their assumptions aside, set their preconceptions aside, and really just sort of revel in the complexity of these two women.
So I had a lot of fun doing this book, and I want to do another book, although I don't know about what. Did you have fun doing your book, and do you want to do another book?
Oh my gosh, I still feel like that's like I'm in the labor and delivery room and you're asking me what I'm going to name my second child. It really took me a couple of years into the research before the pieces started to fit together for me. And also, there is a certain kind of there's a certain sort of almost church of Reagan that I really sort of had to sort of get through the sort of institutional structures, the myth of Reagan, the reality of Reagan. And there were a number of people. I mean, my opening anecdote of the book is something 97-year-old George Schultz told me. I finally, after a couple of years, started to get to people who were at stages of their lives, I think, where they decided this story must be told now or it's never going to be told. And so once I realized kind of what the thesis of the book was, it was possible to sort of relax. I do not envy you having interviewed Nancy Pelosi myself, though. I mean, I was dealing with somebody who could not sort of, she was not alive, so she couldn't like question every premise. And I know that with Nancy Pelosi, she can be a very difficult interview.
She's guarded. She doesn't invite you to ask personal questions. And she can be kind of fierce. I mean, that is the iron fist. I only felt the iron fist once of Nancy Pelosi in working on this book. It was in the 9th interview I had with her. I had a total of 10 interviews with her for the book over a period of 2 years. And in the 9th interview, I was asking her about something that she didn't think should be in the book. And she said, I don't think that should be in the book. And I said, well, I think it should be in the book. Here's why. And she said, no, I don't think that should be in the book. And she asked more pressing questions, more pointed and pressing questions. And she never raised her voice. She never threatened me. And yet her questions became such that I could feel sweat popping out on my forehead as I explained and defended my point of view. And at the end of this interview, she hadn't changed her mind and I hadn't changed my mind. And I included this in the episode in the book. But when I left, it was about 3:00 in the afternoon. I drove home. I got a glass of wine. I crawled into bed and I watched a series of reruns of Rizzoli and Isles because somehow that seemed comforting. And it made me realize in at least a small way what it must be like to be one of the final holdouts on the Affordable Care Act. And Nancy Pelosi, the speaker, calls you into the office to get your vote and how hard she can be to resist.
So the one issue, though, with Pelosi is that it's just hard. The entire House top tier of the leadership now is roughly 80 years old. Who's the bench? Who's the next Nancy Pelosi?
Well, there are any number of Democratic members of the House who would like to be the next leader, the next Nancy Pelosi. I think when she steps down, probably at the end of this Congress, there'll be a fight. There'll be a contest between different factions of the party, between the most liberal wings and some of the more centrist members. But I do think you can identify some of the very likely candidates. One would be Hakeem Jeffries, the congressman from New York, who is a member of the leadership now. He would be a groundbreaker. He'd be the first person of color to lead a party in Congress. Karen Bass, the congresswoman from California, another possibility. She's a former Speaker of the California House. You can see Adam Schiff, I think, would like to get rise in leadership. There are some others too. I think it's one of those things that is hard to predict. And of course, unlike most of the things that House Democrats have done, it at the end of the day, will not be up to Nancy Pelosi who succeeds her, because not only is it a constituency of like 225 House Democrats, it's a secret ballot. So we'll see if anyone has the vote counting abilities of Nancy Pelosi. Do you think that, I don't think Nancy Pelosi and Nancy Reagan really knew each other. I mean, they were at opposite sides in California, but so far as I know, they didn't have a good or bad relationship. Is that your understanding too?
Yeah, because, by the time Nancy Pelosi gets here, we're talking about the sort of waning days of the Reagan administration. And they sort of, it's like their flights cross as one's leaving and one's coming. And certainly, the 1984 Democratic Convention, as much as it was a triumph for Nancy Pelosi to get it there, I mean, that campaign turns out to be pretty much of a disaster. I mean, Ronald Reagan goes on to win 49 states. If you could just even imagine any candidate today who could pick up 49 states. But it was funny because Ed Rollins, who was the campaign manager in that campaign, was just living in total terror of Nancy Reagan, who, among other things, was convinced that Rollins had it so screwed up that her husband was going to lose California. But one of the things that he does, she and a number of people thought the ads for the 1980 campaign had been not very good. So they get this super high-powered team of ad makers out of essentially the corporate world to make these beautiful, beautiful ads. The one that is most remembered is the Morning in America ad. I mean, it's just an absolute legend of a beautiful ad. It looks like a movie. But Rollins told me that one of the things he did, he said, I blew like $1 million in that campaign that I didn't have to, just running this ad over and over in California, so that Nancy Reagan's friends would see it a lot and she would just get off my case. And at another point, when she is railing on him to open more campaign offices in California, again, a huge waste of money, she finally, terrorizes him in a meeting. And on the way out, Stu Spencer, who is Ronald Reagan's oldest political advisor, says to him, he says, Ed, you're sunk. She could smell fear all over you.
So we're almost out of time. Let's finish with one last question. How about this one? Tell me about a favorite interview when you were doing this book.
Oh gosh, for me, there were so many. And again, Stu Spencer, I just spent hours and hours and hours with. But Nancy Reagan has a stepbrother who is still alive, well into his 90s. I interviewed him on the phone. I never met him in person, but not once, but twice. Just so you know that sibling rivalry, no matter how old you get, never dies. Not once, but twice, he tells me, if you want this to be a good book, you can't just write the nice things. So anyway, how about you?
So there are several, as with you, there were several interviews that were great, and I'm very appreciative of. And I'm sorry that the founders didn't give reporters subpoena power so we could make everybody talk to us. But one interview that I liked a lot was with Newt Gingrich. Now, Newt Gingrich and Nancy Pelosi were on the opposite sides of everything. There are many things. They have many critical things to say about each other. But Newt Gingrich told me that he disagreed with Pelosi on every possible policy, but that when he admired the way she wielded power, and he said that sometimes when he looked at Nancy Pelosi, he saw a fellow pirate, which is, to Newt Gingrich, high praise. Well, Karen, it's been so great. It's been so great to talk to you about your great book.
You too, Susan. And thanks everybody for being with us here today. And again, let's just hope next year everybody's in person.
I'd like to thank you for joining us today for this presentation. We have an amazing lineup of author presentations taking place right here throughout the month of May. You don't want to miss them. Go to Gaithersburgbbookfestival.org and look over the schedule so you can plan the rest of your festival month. And now here is an important message from renowned author and independent bookstore owner, Ann Patchett, and her dog, Sparky. Enjoy, everyone.
I'm Ann Patchett here at Parnassus Books with my dog Sparky, and I want to tell you the importance of supporting your local independent bookstore, Politics and Prose. They are a remarkable partner with this book festival. Now, when a book festival is live, it's really easy. You just go to the table and you buy your book and then you go to the event. But when a book festival is virtual, it gets a little trickier because you're home and you might think, well, I'll just buy the book on Amazon. So I'm here to tell you, don't buy the book on Amazon. For one thing, Jeff Bezos has enough money, right? He's trying to colonize the moon or something. He doesn't need anything that you've got. Politics and Prose, on the other hand, they're your local independent bookstore, and you love them, and they bring you so many events. They work harder than any bookstore I know in their community. And if you want them to be there alive and healthy and well when all this is over, you actually need to support them. They are the people that are putting a tax base in your community, okay? So you have teachers and police officers and firefighters, and when you pay a couple dollars more for a book, you're creating jobs in your community. So enjoy your book festival, support Politics and Prose. Remember, Ann Patchett and Sparky think it's the thing to do. Shop local. Thank you.